We're now going to explore the topic of poverty and a failing economy with Prem Sikka. So Prem's an accountant, as am I, and an academic. He holds the position of Professor of Accounting at the University of Sheffield and is Emeritus Professor of Accounting at the University of Essex. Prem's known to be an outspoken critic of the accounting profession, particularly with regard to its roles in public corporation audit and helping transnational corporations avoid taxes. And Sikka is also a co-founder of the Tax Justice Network, which shines a light on tax avoidance, tax competition and tax havens. So really, I'm delighted to have you here today, Prem. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Esther, and good afternoon, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be here with you, and hopefully we can address some of the issues that are dogging the people now. I would also like to thank Ian and Bob for a very stimulating session, and in some ways, what I have to say also connects with that. I often say to myself, as human beings, if we are lucky, we will be on this planet for about 4,000 weeks. That's about all in most cases. But look at the difficulties we create for humans on this planet, deprive them of adequate food, deprive them of decent housing, human rights, social rights, workers' rights. And at the end, the people who are depriving the people of all these things, they can't take it with them either. So it's hard to know what exactly is it that's motivating many of these people and their political stooges. Perhaps I can, it may be appropriate to start this chat with the Second World War, because that in many ways was a watershed. And that time, the working class was armed to the teeth. It had learned to fight. And certainly the returning soldiers were in no mood to return to a life of organized squalor, deference, and subservience. And it is within that context that the state conceded some concessions. Note, I use here the word concessions rather than any permanent change, because concession is something which can easily be withdrawn, as we are witnessing now. Many of these concessions are being withdrawn. So that was really the kind of background, and a lot has obviously changed since. We have had stronger trade unions until the kind of late 1970s. A larger proportion of the workforce was in trade unions, and collectively, around about 1976, workers had 65.1% of the GDP. So in other words, wages and salaries accounted for about 65.1%. Today, or at the end of last year, workers' share of GDP is barely 50%. That is a massive decline in the total amount of GDP going to workers. And of course, this is before tax. A major reason for this decline is that the working class mistakenly believed that the fable of unchecked social progress would last somehow forever. And that was actually a fable. The working class failed to develop effective social institutions and effective discourses to counter the onslaught from the wounded, richer, wealthy, and capitalist class, who were really determined to reverse many of the gains made by the working class. And Bob earlier on mentioned about the birth of the National Health Service. So in the late 1970s in the UK, there was effectively a right-wing coup. This coup was supposedly bloodless, but has actually caused a large number of deaths, as I will come to later. This coup was incubated by thinkers such as Milton Friedman and von Hayek, and a whole variety of think tanks funded by the ultra-rich. their coup was camouflaged in populist language, but his mission was really to subjugate the working class, roll back the welfare state, and enhance the power of capital and wealthy elites. In that process, universities were also enrolled. I mentioned that because universities turned up in the previous debate. For example, in the business schools, people have been relentlessly taught that the purpose of the firm is to maximize shareholder wealth. Now, shareholders do not and cannot own a company. Shareholders may have controlling rights, but ownership of a company is something entirely different. You can't walk into BP and say, I'm a BP shareholder and I can drive away now with your van, please, and take away your computers because I'm an owner. Well, the police will be called. Of course, ownership is something entirely different. And we increasingly, in the world of capitalism, have absolved shareholders from all kinds of responsibilities. For example, a company can make mega bucks. A tobacco company can make mega bucks, huge profits, by inflicting death and disability. But of course, shareholders are not personally held liable for any of that. All they do is collect dividends and go away. That is about all. So universities have legitimized this view that somehow the business is there only for the benefit of shareholders. And if you look at my field, accounting, and many of you would have come across company balance sheets and company profit and loss accounts, or as they're called, income statement these days. In income statements, payments made to providers of human capital and social capital are described as burdens. So when human capital is invested, labor gets a return in a capitalist language, and that is called a wage. And therefore, once that is labeled as a cost, that means it is a burden. It is being described as a burden. And the basic common logic in capitalist societies is, fueled often by religious beliefs, is that you in this life must lighten your burdens. So there's a whole industry out there which will show you how to cut wages and lighten the burden. The return on investment of social capital, which is often provided by the state in the form of healthcare, education, transport, and other things, that is often called tax. But again, tax is described as a cost, a burden. And there's a whole industry out there which will show you how to dodge taxes. And return to providers of finance is called a dividend. And there's not a single consultant out there who will say, I will come and show you how to reduce the dividend payments. There is no demand. So in other words, the interests of finance capital have been naturalized, and that is what graduates have been taught. So graduates come to the business, students come to business schools. Everyone wants to live in a good house. They want their parent and grandparents to have good food. They want them to have decent pension. They want to breathe clean air. They want to have human rights and social rights. But by the time they leave business schools, all that is driven out of them. They become kind of psychopaths who think the only objective in life is somehow to maximize shareholder wealth. And much of this revolution started in Chicago. And that is why I mentioned Milton Friedman earlier. There is nothing in the Companies Act in the UK which says that the objective of the firm is to maximize shareholder wealth. There is nothing in any legislation in the UK which says that directors are somehow the agents of shareholders. And because, again, Milton Friedman and his mob unleashed on us what is often called in academic circles agency theories, that directors are the agents of the principal. The principal is shareholders and they must do this. That is absolute nonsense. So a key is not only was to this coup I referred to, not only was it to kind of shape the minds of the young people, which is what it successfully did, it was also to reconstruct the state. So after the Second World War, we had an entrepreneurial state which invested in gas, electricity, canals, water, steel, shipbuilding, many other things. It also invested in emerging technologies because private sector was simply unwilling to take the long-term risks. So the state invested in aerospace, biotechnology, information technology. And of course, the new right, as part of its coup, had to restructure the state. Instead of an entrepreneurial state, they wanted a state which guaranteed corporate profits. And that is what has actually happened. So privatization, private finance initiative, outsourcing state functions, and massive direct subsidies guarantee corporate profits. So the state is a key institution here, and it has been completely restructured. So the government's referred to markets. That was the rhetoric. Of course, there is no market when it comes to supplying water. There's only one company, same with sewage, same with the railways, and many other things. Even if you look at banks, half a dozen banks dominate the market. In my field, in accounting, about big four firms dominate the market. So the language is markets, but actually markets are not really there at all. So vast swathes of industries are basically been privatized in the name of market when markets are not there. And that means that those industries can exploit people. And that is exactly what they have been doing. Governments, the state has also eliminated the risk of bankruptcy. So it's kind of odd. We are told we are going to privatize and open up businesses to markets. Well, in markets, those who can't hack it or can't supply goods and services of good quality, they go bust. But we have eliminated the risk of bankruptcy from banks, insurance, pension providers, rail, energy, and many others, because they are simply bailed out. Water companies, look at the damage they are doing. So inevitably, these industries are now devoted to ripping off customers, which creates poverty because ordinary people's disposable income is reduced. They can't simply go and buy goods and services, and the economy suffers. So the government, the state, if you like, in parallel with this, has been imposing real wage cuts, especially on the public sector workers, and also denies welfare rights to the people. But free money is being handed. So last week in Parliament, I asked a question. I put out a little video on Twitter about this. I asked the government, it was a debate about the steel industry. I said, why are you handing millions of pounds to the steel industry for free? Why don't you take an equity stake in those companies? Because that way those companies can have the money if you think that serves some social purpose. And should those companies do well, you will have shares which are valuable, which you can either sell or hold. And that gives you some extra levers for influencing corporate policies. That kind of question obviously had never been raised in recent years in Lords. There was absolute stunned silence from the Conservative benches, and the minister never really recovered from that question for the rest of the debate. And he said, oh, this is a thin end of a wedge. This is a call for nationalisation. Well, actually, he obviously does not understand the difference between nationalisation and an equity stake. Equity stake could be a fraction, 10%, 20%. Like French government has in many companies. So again, in the railway companies, for the last 5 years, we have handed out £45 billion in subsidies. Just the last 5 years, 45 billion. And we have absolutely nothing to show for this. And that handing of money, not only to railways, but to others, is not accompanied by any requirement to control dividends, executive pay, or even provide minimum levels of service. So these companies are also charging us huge amount in fares and impoverishing people. The state, as I said, has been restructured to funnel wealth upwards. So quantitative easing, £895 billion of quantitative easing introduced since the banking crash. This pushed up the asset prices and financial returns, pushed up the price of corporate bonds, for example. And one study estimated that quantitative easing boosted the wealth of the richest 10% in the UK by between 128,000 and £322,000. It is manna from heaven given away. But would any political party wish to levy a wealth tax on these individuals? They say no, they don't want to do this. Bailouts of banks and energy companies have conferred substantial benefits to shareholders again, because the state been restructured. Higher interest rates are a terrible tool for controlling inflation and have inflicted misery on millions. People are being forced to hand their wealth to banks, and government thinks that is a magic answer to inflation. So the first 9 months of this year, the big four banks in the UK have declared a pre-tax profit of £41 billion compared to £23 billion last year. Did they invest more? Did they take any extra risk, extra effort? No, it is simply by the blessing of the state. So these are just some examples of how the wealth is being shuffled to the 1%, or relatively few, and is actually impoverishing millions of people along the way. And of course, ever since Thatcher, there has been a massive attack on the workers' rights and trade unions. And this has also been accompanied by forcing individual households to take debt, which not so long ago would have been responsibility of the state. So the state debt is being put on households. A good example, forcing university students in England, in case anybody Scottish out there, so I just better mention England, forcing university students in England to pay tuition fees and maintenance costs. So as a result, £200 billion of debt now roughly exists for students and graduates. Not so long ago, that would have been paid by the state. Okay. Bob earlier talked about the queues for NHS treatment. Well, we have a 7.8 million unfulfilled hospital appointments. So people have a choice. Either they can suffer or die, deplete their savings, or borrow money to get healthcare. There is, again, something that enriches the elite. And the government has raised the state pension age, especially for women. So the result of that is what? People work longer, and we know that the poor have a shorter life expectancy than the rich. That means the poor collect the state pension for a shorter duration. So they die. So their pension part effectively is getting transferred to the richer people who live longer. Okay? So wherever you look, you can see what the new right has done. So inevitably, the rich have got richer. But the other side of the story is that the poor are getting poorer, okay, because their wealth is being taken away from them. So government policies have increased the concentration of wealth. The richest 1% of Britons at the moment have more wealth than 70% of the population put together. Okay, so that is a damning statistic. Whenever in Parliament I call for higher taxes on the rich, the government ministers stand up and they say, oh, the top 10% pay, or top 1% pay a third of all income tax. And I always say, yeah, I can address that for you. There's a very simple answer to that. Let us have equitable distribution of income. Therefore, these people won't pay that much tax. How about it? I've never, ever had an answer to that. Maybe I'm speaking again next week on the budget on Wednesday. I doubt that I will get that kind of answer. So the richest 50 families have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population. But it doesn't end there. Our tax system is utterly rigged. For example, wages are taxed at rates between 20 and 45%. Capital gains made from the sale of second homes, artworks, antiques, stock, shares, etc., are taxed at a rate of 20 to 45%, at 10 to 28%. So capital gains taxed at 10 to 28%, labor wages taxed at 20 to 45%. Dividends are taxed in the range of 8.75 to 39.35%. Why? There's no logical reason for this. They both have identical purchasing power. Even worse, workers pay national insurance, but the recipients of dividend, capital gains, investment income pay zero national insurance, even though they can use the National Health Service and social care. So again, you can see what capture of the state does, okay? And this is really the crucial. So since the late 1970s, successive governments, and in that I include the Blair government, have normalized a discourse which prioritizes the welfare of the rich. And they assume, or they tell us, that a nation's salvation lies in handing more wealth to the rich. They won't take any wealth tax. You can hear that now from Starmer-led Labour Party too. That no, we mustn't tax the wealthy. They will run away. Run away where? What are they going to do with this wealth? And why should they not really be taxed more? So, earlier this morning I was having a dialogue with another leading parliamentarians, and I was trying to tell this person, look, at the moment people are talking about climate change. Climate change caused by carbon emissions, but what the richest 1% are causing 66% of carbon emissions. And the principle is that polluter must pay, which everybody accepts. If so, we've got to levy wealth taxes on them to reduce their habits of polluting. Okay, and so we had an interesting kind of a dialogue. So they talk about handing more wealth to the rich, but there's never a talk about incentivizing workers who invest their brains and brawn to generate wealth. There, the government says wages are inflationary, but absolutely no controls on profiteering, no controls on capital gains, dividends, executive pay, share buybacks. So you can see, in a sense, the kind of project the New Right started in 1970s coming together. And what Bob said earlier mixes up with that. So economic incentives are handed to the rich, but not to the poor. So, for example, we are constantly told that we must set aside some money, assuming somebody has some money, for pension for when you retire. So let's look at that data. The most recent data we have is for 2020-21, and the government handed 67.3 billion of tax relief on pension contributions. That's quite a lot of money, 67.3 billion. 58% of that went to just 4.7 million individuals who pay tax at a rate of 40 and 45%. 48% then is shared by 27 million basic wage taxpayers. Now, if your income happens to be less than 12,570, you get zero. Yeah, you get nothing, even though you may be on auto enrollment, absolutely nothing. Last year, there were 21 million adults, that is 42% of UK adults, whose income was less than the personal allowance. So absolutely zero support. Okay. Now, I've always said what we should do is give everybody a 20% credit. Everybody. Don't care whether you're 45% or zero rate taxpayer. Give everybody a 20% credit. If we did that, that will leave 14.5 billion spare for the government. And it can do with it whatever it wants. Invest in the NHS, infrastructure, increase benefits, whatever. Since 2010, between 450 billion and 1,500 billion pound of taxes have not been collected due to evasion, avoidance, and error. 450 billion is official HMRC figure. 1,500 billion is a number which some of us have generated because we don't believe in HMRC's model. Okay. Now, many of the tax dodges are designed by big accounting firms. And often HMRC takes the schemes to court and the judges criticize the firms. But no big accounting firm or any of its partner has ever been investigated, fined, prosecuted because they're promoting tax dodges. If you're a firm like Google, Microsoft, Starbucks, you might not pay taxes. You can have a one-to-one meeting with HMRC. You can have a sweetheart deal. That is okay. Parliament can't scrutinize any of those deals because when it comes to any investigations in Parliament, the standard reply is we can't disclose somebody's tax affairs, they are private. Therefore, we have absolutely no idea on what happens. But by a coincidence, some former directors of HMRC have found jobs with big accounting firms once they leave office. So what goes on, absolutely no idea. And in the 2019 Labour manifesto, there was a promise that if Labour came to power, they would force all large companies to publish their tax returns, and also wealthy individuals at that time, which was talked about, was people with income over 1 million. Now Parliament can look at whether HMRC is being fair and how on earth is somebody dodging taxes. Would the current Labour leadership stick to that promise? Well, I'm sure you will get your answer soon. Okay. So on the workers, so there are just some of the examples are given of how wealth has funneled upward, how our institutions work. There's a lot more, but I'll just pause there. Now, on the workers' side, the average real wage is back to the 2005 level. So hardly any change in nearly 20 years. So when I challenged the minister recently, a minister in the Lord said, oh, well, since 2010, we have had a 24% growth in GDP. My comment, please show me that the wages have grown by 24% as well. In other words, they talk about growth, but it never really percolates down. It is just taken by the people who are at the top. The UK median wage at the moment is around 29,500. That is the average for the country. Of course, it varies by regions. That means 50% of the workers earn less than 29,500. By a coincidence, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has recently said that a single person in the UK needs to earn 29,500 to reach a minimal acceptable standard of living. That means half the people haven't got it. And they said a couple with two children needs to earn £50,000 between them. Well, of course, if both parents are working, raises all sorts of other issues about bringing up children. And many of the British people I meet, they don't want to have any children. They're saying we can't afford it. So the government, announced a budget yesterday. Did they provide any extra funding for childcare? No, nothing this week. Yeah, nothing whatsoever. So again, they're not connecting the dots. So around 19.2 million people, that is 29% of the population, lives in households below the minimum income standard, and they're deprived of a chance to live with dignity. Whereas, some people's idea is, well, all people on low income need to do is just have a meal and huddle around a fire. But why should people not go out occasionally to a restaurant or a cinema or a theater or meet a friend, get on a bus or a train? They just don't want them to do it. So number of people experiencing destitution has more than doubled in the last 5 years to 3.8 million. And again, and the government doesn't offer anything to the people at the bottom. Like I said, this year, I think there is close to 19 million people whose income is going to be less than 12,570. What did the Chancellor offer them? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. They don't pay national insurance, therefore they don't get anything. The Trussell Trust has handed out 116% more food parcels this year than the last 5 years, compared to the last 5 years. So more and more people relying on food banks. In order to gauge what is going on in society, I do two things. And even before I speak in the Lords, I go to food banks to see what's going on, and I stand outside pawnbrokers to see what exactly are the poor doing. So when I go to food banks, I meet teachers, police, firefighters, but more often supermarket workers who just, can't. So Sainsbury's chief executive is paid 200 times the average wage of a shop worker. Did he work 200 times more? No, of course he did not. But nevertheless, that is what happened. So those workers get universal credit, which we fund through taxes, which means we are subsidizing, funding corporate profits indirectly. Why should, in this day and age, people be relying on charity and universal credit simply to survive? So the government's own data has shown that homelessness has increased by more than 10% since last year. And that is not a lifestyle choice, as Suella Braverman would have us believe. 7.8 million unfulfilled NHS hospital appointments, 2.6 million people are chronically ill, and the government is threatening to withdraw their benefits unless they work. Numerous children going hungry, up to £1 million, and indeed the government imposed a two-child benefit cap, which deprives the poorest families of £3,000 a year. And indeed, Keir Starmer said not so long ago that if Labour were in power, they would continue with this, which is odd. So even to relieve that poverty, restore that cap, abolish that two-child benefit cap, you need about £1.5 to £2 billion. This year, in this tax year, the government is estimated to spend £1,185 billion. Are we imagining that the extra £1.5 to £2 billion is really going to break them? No. I gave you an example earlier of how government could raise £14.5 billion simply by changing the way pension tax relief is handed out. Problem solved. But there is no empathy for the working class. Malnutrition, scurvy, and rickets have returned to the UK. People are being treated for that in hospitals. Most of the maternity units in NHS hospitals are not safe enough. Child death rates are rising, with the steepest rise in deaths for children under 5. People live in poor housing conditions. Between 2012 and 2019, some 335,000 people died from austerity. That is 48,000 a year. That is based on an academic study published in a peer-reviewed journal. Now, you can multiply the 48,000 a year by 14 years of Conservative government rule, and you can see what has actually happened. The Times newspaper did a study, and they said that between 2018 and 2022, nearly 1.5 million people died because they were waiting for NHS hospital appointments. And add to that, about another 240,000 died from COVID because government in 2016 was told that NHS would not be able to withstand a pandemic, but did absolutely nothing about it. So there may be some overlap in these figures, but we are looking over 2 million people died. Possibly, many of them would have survived. That is democide at a huge scale. To give you the context, during the Second World War, the Luftwaffe bombing of the UK cities resulted in death of 70,000 civilians. So we are looking at 3 times as much. Little murmur. Indeed, I called a debate on this issue in the Lords, did not get a single question answered by the minister. Okay, but I will be after them again soon. So, of course, the poor, the dispossessed can take to the streets, but increasingly demonstrations are being criminalized. People may wish to go on strikes, but strikes are being made unlawful, and we have another thing coming to us in Parliament soon. Okay. The Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act 2021. This sounds a mouthful. We often call it CHIS in Parliament. Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act has a chilling section in it. Under this act, the state, that is the government and a number of regulators, which includes the Financial Conduct Authority for some reason, can authorize state and non-state actors, means state employees or non-state employees, to commit murder, torture, rape, phone tapping with complete immunity from prosecution and without any court order, because it is, and I quote, this is a bit in the legislation in quotation mark, because it is in the interest of the economic well-being of the United Kingdom. That is appalling. So poor are being suppressed from every side. Okay, so this is what happens. So why is all this happening, and why is it not really challenged? We have to look at our political institutions. The rich fund the political parties, and somebody earlier said, maybe we have the best government the money can buy. Well, unfortunately, moneyed interests have already bought it. They fund the political parties, fund the individual legislators, and of course, threatening issues are organized off the agenda. Our regulators are pretty hopeless. They're pretty ineffective, and that really continues. We can change the first past the post to PR system, as many would call it, but I doubt that would make much difference because they will still sing from the same hymn sheet. They are still devoted to the same kind of outcomes. So we need a bigger kind of evolution of human consciousness. Okay, so there is very little space for doing anything from the left. Much of the mainstream media, as Bob pointed out earlier, is controlled by corporations and wealthy elites. And you can see how they treated Jeremy Corbyn. And even former army generals said that if Corbyn was elected, they would consider launching a coup to remove him. Yet, no huge public disquiet about this. We are almost becoming feudal. We are going back to feudalism. Note how the political leaders have to go and kiss the hands of the corporate moguls. Note how Tony Blair, Keir Starmer, and others have to seek approval from Rupert Murdoch and say, please, can I become the leader of my party and fight the election, and you will permit it. Yeah. So just note the power of corporations. In the US Revolution, the slogan was no taxation without representation. Now we have representation without any taxation. Not only the case I mentioned, but just look at giant corporations. The actual and potential governments have to give allegiance to the defense industry and promise that they won't cut expenditure on arms. But they will openly tell us they will cut welfare, they will cut the NHS, they will cut wages. But my God, the profits of the defense industry must not be touched. And everybody will say, yeah, you've got to give them more. You've got to increase more spending. And of course, as earlier the name of BlackRock came up, organizations like that exercise huge influence. Tax policies squeeze workers, but political parties promise to go easy on the wealthy. So nobody's advocating wealth tax, or they don't want to even go and curb the loopholes on inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is easy enough to avoid if you set up trusts. You don't even have to go offshore. But they simply won't do it. And when you listen to political parties that talk about magical fiscal rules, there are no fiscal rules. They're just invented. Okay, so after the Second World War, Clement Attlee's government borrowed money, which added up to about 256% of GDP to rebuild the country. Now we are getting close to 100 and saying, oh, it's terrible. I don't remember the previous generation sitting around a table fretting about, oh, the government debt was too high, we therefore must not have healthcare, must not have pensions, must not have decent railway, must not have decent jobs. These are all sort of being invented to straitjacket governments. So basically, our political system is thoroughly corrupt and it is disconnected from the daily struggles of the people. And we need to change that. It's also interesting to me that for a long, long time, trade unions challenged the residues of feudalism and said, if people work, they must be paid. But now we have gone into an era where people work but are paid zero. And the combination of capitalism and technology sort of achieves that position. So you go to a supermarket and you're encouraged. It is convenient for you to go through a self-checkout. So you work, you give your labor for free, you check out, Tesco's profits go up, their share price goes up, and all that is wonderful. You use Google's software, Maps, you download it, and you tell it where you're going. Now Google is able to predict where there will be a traffic jam, and therefore more people log on to the Google Maps to see if there is an alternative. As a result, Google can show there are more hits on its software. It charges more for advertising, and the share prices go up. And this is why in the last Labour manifesto under Corbyn, there was a mention the Labour would ask, in lieu of this Labour, ask giant companies to give 10% or some shares, which will go in a pool. Yeah, because people have already worked for it. So at the moment, we are returning back to kind of feudalist practices. So democracy is far more than just adding a cross on a piece of paper. We need to democratize corporations, need to put workers on company boards. We need to get workers to vote on executive pay. We need to get water company customers to vote on executive pay. Okay? And bank customers too, energy company customers too. We need workers on regulatory bodies like the Financial Conduct Authority. We need customer elected directors so that they can't just brush scandals under the carpet. And so we need to democratize institutions in a whole variety of ways. Well, I think in my enthusiasm, I've exceeded my time here. So I will just stop here. Thank you.